So it's noon now, so I guess I'll get started. So first off, so for part of this talk, I've made a Python notebook that has some machine learning models that can be trained. So if people want to follow along with that on their end, I have a QR code that you can scan to open on your phone and showing URLs that's here and also written on the wall over there. It's also going to be in the upper corner of the slides if people want to see it later. So I guess when people are finished eating or if they want to just get prepared now, they can. But basically, just so I guess, so yeah, so I'm Bjorn. I'm in my 6th year now here at Brown, and I've done some various machine learning projects for research and done some stuff to play around with machine learning as well. I'm also one of the people here at SMLI. And so basically, the purpose of this talk is to give an overview of machine learning and kind of basically go from the most basics of how we do linear fitting or linear regression to how you can then expand those same concepts to do machine learning, which in a sense, it's doing something very similar. It's just using a lot more variables. And so basically, so the idea is I'm going to start out talking about traditional fitting here, and then go on to some of the basics. So I'm going to talk about, in this, describe how a fully connected or a dense network is produced and made, as well as convolutional networks. These are basically the two most common types of neural networks that people would use. So in addition to going over these, I then have the Python notebook, which goes over how you can produce these networks in TensorFlow using 2 separate methods, as well as how you can train them in 2 separate methods. And then afterwards, I'm going to then go over a few other just kind of common network architectures and describe some of their use cases. There is one other thing I wanted to mention, which is I try to draw some analogies with machine learning to some other things we might be more familiar with, just from kind of the courses we take. These aren't necessarily saying this is what machine learning is doing underneath the hood. It's more of saying, like, maybe you can kind of think about it in these ways to help draw out why it makes sense that we can do something this way. So starting out, so basically, so for linear regression, the idea is that we want to fit our data to something. So here, we can just start with some amount of data. So basically, it's a straight line that I just added some variation to, so like random noise on the y values, and I plotted. And so basically how this works is we would give our computer some sort of assumed function. I'm going to guess based on how the data is arranged. It's 1-degree polynomial. And then our computer is going to use some algorithm that's going to learn what these best coefficients are. And so basically it's going to do that, and then it's going to form some nice fit. But what actually is the computer doing to go from here's a function to here is a fit, especially if maybe this is more complicated. So basically, as mentioned, we would start with data, and then we would go and we would give it some assumed function that we want to try to fit to our data. It's going to make some initial guess at the coefficients. So they're going to be initialized to some value, maybe something to 1, maybe just random values. It depends on the algorithms you're using. And then what it's going to do is it's going to calculate some sort of metric. And this metric in general tells us how bad our guess is, or how bad our function is fitting our data. The big reason we want to say how bad it is that if we want to then minimize this value, then we can say, okay, if it's bad at fitting it, we want to minimize it, then that can converge to 0. If we wanted to instead say, how good is it? Well, that has no upper bound on how good it could be. And then that can make it very hard to try to target some metric for the algorithm. So we say, okay, let's see how bad it is and minimize that. So in this case, we're going to be working with this mean square error. And you just look at it from this function. So basically what it does, it effectively just looks at how far away is each of our guesses from our fit function from the actual data point. And so basically it can calculate a gradient. So basically it constructs some high-dimensional slope that it then says, okay, this is basically how, if I were to adjust the weights, how we might move along this big slope of our badness function. And so it wants to then try to minimize the values of these coefficients. So it would slide down in this gradient in order to find the minimum of this badness function. So here, it basically does that just by taking some derivatives, and then it can adjust all of the values of the variables that move towards the minimum, ideally the maximum minimum. So basically it can go through some iteration and then adjust it by some delta value, and then gets a new best fit function, or a new fit function, and then it can just iterate this multiple times. And then from this, it eventually goes at some best, some best function. So basically, it would break down into the following steps. Define some function that matches some set of inputs to some set of outputs. This doesn't need to just be some scalar value. We can map some array of input values to some array of output values. We can calculate, some sort of loss function, which basically says how poorly are our predictions. So how far are the predicted values from this function from the real values. And then we would adjust the parameters associated with our function in a way that would minimize this function so that the badness of it goes to 0. And then we would repeat this until this loss stops decreasing. And this works really well, but it has the big problem. We have to tell it what our function is. And so what if we can't just trivially define a function? Maybe, if it's physics, your on-sots is very hard to arrive at. If it's computer vision, how do you define a function that tells a car whether it sees a stop sign or a speed limit? It's not easy to make some basic mathematical relationship that we can just define as some linear function. So is there any hope on what we can do in this case? So I then want to talk about linear operators. Because a linear operator, as we know, basically a matrix, it can map some vector of inputs to an output vector, which is what we're trying to do with our functions. And we can represent functions and transformations as linear operators. So can we then try to do something similar if we want to try to understand the correlations between, our data and what it is we want to predict? So what if then, instead of giving it a function, we give our network a computer something like this, where we have this array here, which is features of our data, some sort of input basis. And then we have some matrix, which we say, okay, rather than giving it some function, we just say the parameters in this matrix is our unknown function. And then, the output from our function, we can say, okay, that this is some other, outputs and some other basis. And so the idea is, can we use the same fitting rules to try to then construct our matrix? And can we get this to then, properly model abstract and difficult functions? And kind of, but not really. So this is called a perceptron, what I described. It's a very basic algorithm, which you just have, some big matrix that you multiply an input vector by, and then you get an output. It faces some very basic characteristics of linear algebra, which is the big thing that we need to overcome to go into more modern machine learning. So the size of a matrix is going to be defined by the length of the input and the output vector. So as an example, if x and y are scalars, and you just want to match or map, some input data to some, description of it, and you only have one variable, your matrix is then only going to be able to be one variable as well. You can't go to anything more complicated than a one-dimensional polynomial. If you go to a 2x2 matrix, once again, you kind of have these linear terms and some correlation terms. But basically, a single matrix doesn't actually have enough information to really encapsulate very complicated correlations and relationships between variables. And it just can't actually encapsulate any kind of very complicated form of some function that we may be trying to find. And so basically, the big thing is this single multiplication step is not really quite enough. So what happens if we try to then do some iterative multiplication and do multiplication multiple times in a row with these big matrices? So what if we say, all right, what if we want to make a function that we represent as just iteratively multiplying linear operators together to try to construct something that is complicated? And so we can represent high order polynomials as, a product of, so we know we can represent a higher polynomial as a product, like for example, of first order polynomials. And, you can Taylor expand things. So you can kind of see maybe how this might work. You can then use a bunch of matrices together to try to represent something that's more complicated than just, basic matrix multiplication. So what if we say, okay, we want to mathematically do this. We have some input or some information about our data, we multiply it through some large matrix, and then we take that output, multiply it through another large matrix, take that output through another large matrix, and then all the way get some information out. And we say we want to make it so our algorithm is then adjusting what is going on inside of each of these matrices. One thing that's nice as well is we can, even in this example, the dimensions of B is basically some sort of free parameter. So we can give ourselves a very large amount of variables and information to work with, even though, so we're no longer limited necessarily by the size of our input and our output vectors. And then once again, if we're doing these multiple internal steps of matrix multiplication and operations, then this can kind of encapsulate more complicated features of this function that we're trying to model using these matrices. But it has a big problem, which is that this, which we started out, we can just use associative properties of matrix multiplication to rewrite it as x times the product of our matrices, which is just x times a single matrix. So even if we make B 1000 by 1000 and x and y dimensions, it ends up that almost all the free parameters in this would just be degenerate, and we actually don't gain any more new information by doing this. We're just giving more work for our computer to do. So yeah, basically associativity ends up ruining the ability to use a bunch of matrices in order to model something that's much more complicated. So then it comes to the question of, is there some way that we can just break the associative properties of matrix multiplication in order to possibly exploit abilities to correlate variables in these more complicated ways? So then what happens, say, if we do make a matrix multiplication step, pass the output vector through then a function? And can we find functions that then might break this associativity? And the answer is yes. And this is basically the most basic form of neural networks. So this is something called a sigmoid function. The neural and neural network comes from the fact that people say it's kind of like an activation where low values, it's not really activated. If you start to go through some threshold, it then activates. And it ends up that this kind of breaks these associativity properties, and as I mentioned, allow us to construct more complicated models from basically just consecutive matrix multiplication. And so the one problem, though, is that specifically for this, so as I mentioned, in the algorithms that we use for fitting, we want to calculate all of these derivatives and gradients in order to minimize some value. And it ends up, if you pass a bunch of matrices through this function, when you go to calculate the gradients, it will then start to converge to 0. And it ends up that you can't actually make very, very complicated networks out of consecutive matrix multiplication that is separated by a function like this. But it ends up that computer scientists managed to find a new function, not the Heaviside function, but a rectified linear unit, which is just a Heaviside function. And it ends up that this still allows us to break these associative properties of matrix multiplication that were making it so we couldn't actually use that to gain new information. And then also it is able to preserve the gradients we can calculate a lot better, so that if we want to use these algorithms to try to minimize some sort of loss function, we can still calculate it despite having super, super large amounts of consecutive matrix multiplication steps. So then now going into what this is describing, so this would be a feed-forward neural network, also known as a dense network. And so it's literally just a set of iterative matrix multiplication operators. You have some input vector, you multiply it through some matrix. Generally, you can also have some extra term you would add to all the values of the outputs, but then those would then just be a new vector. You run it through this ReLU activation function, and then you run it through another matrix, and then do it, same things. There's activation function step, another matrix, activation function step, and then basically you'll get it to be the output size of some vector, which describes, whatever your output basis is. And yeah, so that is the most basic kind of neural network, and they're incredibly powerful. So this is now where I have an example. If people want to follow along, they can use the QR code or the bit.ly URL to go to a Google Colab page. Otherwise, I'm just going to kind of go through the code without running it and kind of describe what it's doing, what's happening, and how you can, if you want to, construct a network on your own. So basically, mnist is kind of the go-to example of machine learning. And basically, it's, can a computer learn to identify handwritten numbers? So I think they went to a bunch of high school students and had them write 0 through 9, and then it was uploaded to some big database that's used a lot for basic image recognition. So basically, we have 28 by 28 images, which are pixel size between 0 and 255. So basically that our input basis, what we'd have would be some vector of length 768, where each element in the vector represents some position in an image and how dark it would be. Our output then is either going to be, is it a 0, a 1, a 2, all the way up, or an 8 or a 9. So it's trying to map what is, the relationship between the density of, ink when someone wrote this down at a specific location to a number that's being drawn. And so basically, kind of a brief overview. of what we would do is load in a data set, which would be this mnist data set. We would do something where we would split it into what's called a piece where we would train on and a piece we would test on. Sometimes people would do the testing piece in separate ones. But the main idea is that when we train a neural network, we want to make sure that it still works on pieces of data that we don't train it on. So the testing set is kind of this training agnostic, or this, I guess, this data that the network is agnostic to when it's training, to make sure that it is able to, interpolate to and extrapolate to other data points it hasn't seen. Additionally, it can do some pre-processing, which basically is some extra maybe computation steps we do to the data to get into a specific format before we would run it through a neural network. Then we're going to construct the model, set some initial training parameters, and then train the network. So this would do something called forward propagation, which is just fancy words for saying we take our input and we would move it all the way through a neural network. Something called backwards propagation, where we then basically compute a loss function. Then we would calculate a bunch of derivatives, and then we would adjust what the value of all the different weights and the matrices are in order to try to decrease the loss function by just moving down these derivative gradient values. And then we're basically going to repeat this multiple times over many epochs for our entire data set. And then finally, as well, when we're doing this, we can check our results and the performance on our testing data set, which we aren't training on. So for people who have the code open, this is the first block. So basically the first thing, it's Python. We are importing a bunch of libraries. For this data set, we don't have to go off and find it somewhere. It ends up that actually TensorFlow has it already in the libraries. So we're going to use this library to just directly get our data set, which is the first little function down below. So basically, this lets us get our data. So we're basically telling TensorFlow what the name is of the data set we want. So we say we want you to give us the mnist set. And then we're saying that we want you to give us the data that is pre-split into these predefined training and testing sets. Shuffle just means that when you give us these values, we want you to kind of give them to us in a random order. We're saying as supervised. So basically this means that we want you to also tell us when you give us each of our images, we also want you to just have a number that says what that number is. And then finally, this extra piece just giving us our metadata, but then that's why we're receiving this VS info here. And then basically, so this is going to be the next block of the data, which is kind of this pre-processing step. So kind of just going through this and describing what you would see, because this is very standard for any kind of machine learning code. You'd call this mapping function. Basically what mapping does, so it's kind of weird because TensorFlow is now very easy to work with on a surface level. But if you were to actually look at what it's doing a lot more complicated things. So you can kind of call functions in strange ways. So basically what we're doing is up here, we're defining this normalize image function. And all that it does is it takes our image and it says, I want you to go and for each of the image pixels, turn it from an 8-bit integer to a floating point number and divide it by 255. So now each of our image values, rather than going from our pixels, rather than going from 0 to 255, goes from 0 to 1 and can be decimal numbers. And so basically, we define this function, and then we call this map function. And as an input, we give it a function. And then basically that tells TensorFlow that when you're reading this data. I want you to then apply this function to the data as it's being read. This next part here, this num-parallel calls TF data auto tune, that's just for some like optimization. It's basically saying, I want you to, when you do this, I want you to run multiple images in parallel to speed this up. The number of parallelization, you will figure it out based on the computer. That's basically what you're telling it. We're then going to do something where we will shuffle our data, or telling it that we want it to shuffle. What this means is, so when we do our training, we're going to train over a single epoch when we're adjusting all these weights. And then when we do that, it's going to look at every single image in our training data set. Shuffle then says between every single, between every epoch, I want you to randomize the order of those images. And so for certain reasons why you might want to do this, imagine if somehow your data was in some way where the last 10th of the data was all zeros somehow. We only look at how our network performs after it's run through all of the data. And if the last 10% would be all zeros, then our network is going to be biased towards identifying zeros well. So we want to make sure we continually shuffle it and randomize the order of the data such that we aren't going to necessarily be biased based off of the fact that we keep training our network on the same data in the same order as we go through it. Now we go and we say we're going to give it a batch size. So what this means is when we run our image through the neural network, we're actually going to do it 128 images at a time. So we're going to run 128 images through, and then it's going to basically calculate how much it needs to change the network to improve the performance for each of those images, and then average that together. Once again, this actually helps the network perform better overall. By doing this, it also makes it so it can run things faster, because a big thing that's done now is you would run it on a GPU, which is very good at doing a lot of things in parallel. So it ends up that it can actually do these calculations for multiple images at the exact same time. And then finally, we're setting this prefetch parameter. As I mentioned, we do things in parallel. Prefetch, so basically when you have a neural network, normally you have your computer's processor, which is actively taking data, moving it in and out of memory, performing this mapping function on it, and then sending it to normally a GPU, which is then running and doing all the matrix multiplication and adjusting all the weights and everything. Prefetch basically means I want you to continually to read data, and I want it to be in RAM and ready to send to the GPU before the GPU even says it needs it. Once again, this is just optimizations on making things run faster. And then down below, we're basically doing the same thing for our testing set. The one thing is, though, we don't actually shuffle it. And the reason for that is because shuffling is important if we're training, but when we're not training, we don't really need to care about the order as much. So basically, this next part is where we're constructing a network. So this is basically what it kind of looks like. We start, and so we have our 28 by 28 image, and we unwrap it into a single one-dimensional array of length 728. And then we say, I want you to take a, so dense is basically saying, I want this network to then have a matrix with an output length of 128. And then I want to do it again, and then again, and then another one with an output of 10, because we have 10 different numbers. Inside of each of these, I say I want my activation function to be ReLU. So it's basically taking the outputs of this, and then it's running it through that, basically I have a side function. And then it's running it through these through. And the other thing too is that, so it's using something called a sequential model. So basically, as I mentioned, there's multiple ways to construct a neural network in TensorFlow. So basically what you do is you just take, kind of these Lego building blocks, and then you can put a bunch of them in a list, which this is wrapped in, brackets. And then you tell TensorFlow to make a sequential model, and then it automatically knows, okay, this means I want to just make one where it goes through each of these, all the outputs from one, it goes into the outputs from the other. It's very easy to make networks like this. But in more complicated networks, you might not want to necessarily have it go where everything goes, just through one to the other to the other. Maybe you want to split your data so some goes through one input pipeline and one through another, or maybe you want to connect these up in these very strange ways. That would use a different way of producing a network, which I also have an example of. But for a lot of basic things, you can just use the sequential, which is very nice and compact and easy to do. So then we're going to set up some parameters. So basically, we have something called an optimizer. An optimizer is basically a function. So when we want to adjust all of our weights after it's seen data in order to decrease this loss function. Sorry. Yeah, so when we go to decrease this loss function, the optimizer is basically telling our network how we want to do that. There's a lot of complicated stuff about optimizers. To first order, you'll basically always use Atom, and then always use the default value here, which basically tells it, how much it wants to adjust things. But you'll pretty much always just have it look like this. Then you have your loss. So as in the example I gave, we had this MSE value. Here, it basically, we're giving it a different function called this sparse, mainly the categorical cross entropy. This is basically then telling our network, what is the form of the function we want to minimize. And then we have metrics, which is basically, do we also want our network to calculate some other stuff for us automatically that we can use to say, okay, let's see how this is performing. And then, so for this, also loss function we use, this is very common in anything where we're doing kind of like recognition or classification. It's really similar to basically, entropy, and it kind of comes from that in information theory. But this is effectively what we're doing. We have some output array, and we say we want to go through and take the logarithm of those output values, multiplied by the actual value, and that's the loss value. So the raw loss value, you may notice, is only going to be the value associated with what we want it to be. It ends up, though, when all this under the hood machinery works and calculates all these derivatives and does all this chain rule and everything, it actually considers all of the other values as well. And so basically, then we're going to train our function. So this is using something called fit. And that is basically just a very basic built-in function to TensorFlow, which literally says, all right, now train the model. And so we've given it what the training set is, how many epochs it is, what to validate it on. And so basically, as I mentioned, what it does is it does this forward propagation where it takes some data, runs it through this network, and then it's going to calculate these loss values for each of these images. Then it does backward propagation. So it's going to calculate kind of these loss functions, take derivatives to find the gradient, and then it's going to adjust all these weights in each of these matrices. And this is done based off of the loss function we chose, as well as the optimizer, which kind of tells us how much we would move these weights. And then it just repeats that for 10 epochs, so over all the data 10 times. And so, yeah, so this is basically, yeah, how you would do a basic neural network. You know, you might want to make these larger and have, you know, more layers. But this, for first order, is very good at doing a lot of things, which is kind of crazy because at the end of the day, it is very basic what's going on. And you can do it with not a lot of code. The main difficulties are just getting your data. That's probably one of the hardest parts. And then, you know, there are some various parameters such as, you know, how to make the network, how wide to make it, how many layers to give it, how to do some things with our optimizer that you would, you know, want to change. But the main thing is it's just computationally intensive, but code-wise, not very difficult. But then, so next, as I mentioned, I want to talk a little bit about convolutional networks. So first, I'll talk about convolution matrices. So basically, rather than using a very large matrix multiplication over and over and over again, the idea is we can use small matrices that we multiply through our image in a specific way to try to extract nearest neighbor features. So basically, these will be convoluted across an input. So what do I mean? So basically, you can have here some 3 by 3 matrix, and then we'll have a larger matrix, and then we do pointwise matrix multiplication. So that'd be -1 times 1 plus 0 times 4 plus 1 times 6 plus -2 times 5, yada yada, all the way through, and it gets a single value, and then it maps that to a new pixel in a new image. And so this has, so basically what we'll do is we'll make a network. So a single layer, rather than being a big single matrix, will be a bunch of these tiny filters that we would then run across the inputs. And these can be 1-dimensional, 2-dimensional, or 3-dimensional matrices. I've never actually seen it used with 3-dimensional matrices, but I know it's in TensorFlow now. But in general, I feel like you'll probably see it with 1-dimensional matrices or 2-dimensional matrices. And then so some general kind of jargon associated with them. We have what's called a kernel size. That's, as I mentioned, this is a kernel size of 3 by 3. We then also have what is called a stride. So what that means is a stride of 1 is you'll take it and multiply it by this 3 by 3 block, and then you'll move it over 1 pixel, and then do another 3 by 3 block, and then make the next image thing. Move it again by 1 to the next image, or the next pixel in the new image. You can do what's called, maybe if you do a stride of 2, you go here, do this 3 versus 3, and then move it over 2, and do the next 3 by 3 over there. But it still only move over 1 image pixel. There's also something called padding, which basically is we can also choose to surround our initial image in zeros and include those when we do convolutions to affect the size of our output image. But basically, so yeah, so doing these convolutions, it's very good at extracting different features from images. And so basically, this can be good for any single data set you might have or type of data where in your input, the order in your variables matters. Because basically, if you have ordered data, then it might mean that there are specific correlations between nearby data points or nearby variables that could be exploited by these. And it's also nothing new. So basically, these are all known common filters. If you do basic image recognition and like a lab with a camera that you're trying to, you know, find features on something you're looking at with some piece of equipment, it's probably, you know, if you want to do a straight line detection, you know, with LabVIEW, for example, it's just using one of these filters and multiplying it through, you know, an image you give it, and then it'll say, oh, here's the straight lines in the image. So yeah, so basically the thing with machine learning is rather than giving it known filters, we have it to train and learn what the different numbers would be in order to construct the filters itself. And then additionally, with machine learning, we're able to iteratively apply convolutions multiple times to try to extract more and more abstract features. So basically, a standard formation of a convolutional neural network is basically, multiple layers of these convolutions. So basically, a single layer would consist of many filters. So on this image on the right, you'd say that each of these horizontal lines would be a set of filters for a different layer. So this top one, you can tell it's given a cat. Each one is extracting some information about the image. Then if you go to the next layer, it's being run on the outputs of the first layer to try to get more abstract features from a map of abstract features. So every single time you basically then are getting out new images of new, further abstract, so basically further abstract, features of images. Also, normally when you do this, each time the images will be compressed. So if you notice down here, the number of pixels is smaller than up above. This is going to be affected by the stride, as I mentioned. If you move over 2 every time you do this multiplication, then your images are going to shrink by a factor of 2. There's also something called pooling, which is done, which is just an extra compression step. The reason for this is if you were to do this a whole bunch of times and don't do any compression. So suppose you have an image that is 3 by 28 by 28, and then you say, I want to make 64 filters that I'm going to run through it with a stride of 1. The output will be a 28 by 28 image with, instead of having pixels for red, blue, and green, it has 64 pixel maps for all these features it extracts. And you can kind of make the RAM explode. Not really, but the amount of RAM blow up very fast, and then you're just not going to actually be able to train anything, especially if it's kind of overkill. So that's why it can be important to do this compression if you want to do it a whole lot of times. And then finally, what ends up happening is you normally then run it through another fully connected layer, by which I mean just another big matrix. And so for why this might work and to give some intuition, because basically the way I always think of convolutions is that it's kind of like you're almost like Fourier transforming your data. So basically our input data, as a single image, it is an array of input features, but it's not always the best representation of your data. So if you were to take a picture, say, of a cat, your data is arranged in, basically it tells you when light, bounces off it, what is the percentage of photons in certain energy ranges, and then that's binned in red, blue, and green. But that's not necessarily what's important for telling us something is a cat or a dog or a chair or something. So basically, every time you run a filter, so we can say we have this kind of like red, blue, and green pixel basis. When you run a filter, we say, okay, we're going to run some sort of transformation. And this transformation is going to then take our image and move it into a new basis. The more times you do these convolutions, you basically say, okay, I have this new kind of abstract feature basis. Now I'm going to run another set of transformations on these kind of abstract features to try to extract even more correlations between those features. So basically, you just continue to do more and more transformations into more and more abstract bases. So kind of why I think this is kind of cool is, so if you think about how quantum mechanics works, which is something we're all familiar with, so often what we do is we write a wave function and an orthonormal basis of our Hamiltonian. And the reason why is this kind of trivializes what we do. If we can have it so say if you have a hydrogen atom, if you have some super complicated algebraic expression that describes your wave function, you can do all of this math to find out, how it's going to change and propagate with time between different energy levels of, the electron orbits. Or if you just represent it in spherical harmonics, you don't have to do any math. Really, you can just do very trivial, basic calculations of saying like, okay, here are these eigenvalues, and we know what the energy will be as a function of time. We know how it might, move around between these energy levels. And so it gets super trivial, but also this isn't just something that's unique to quantum mechanics. This is true for a lot of, any kind of, linear operator, really. So basically, the way I think about, these kind of convolutions and deep convolutions is basically our network wants to model some sort of unknown function. That's basically what machine learning does. But can we represent it as a single matrix, or maybe like one or two matrices, if our data is transformed into, basically an orthonormal basis, or it's the best basis for that data? So basically, these kind of convolutions, it just keeps transforming our data more and more until it can get into this very abstract representation, which, if we look at this, we can't really say what this means, but it can encode all the necessary information needed to make to trivially make a decision. So now going into an example again with the code. So basically, before, as I mentioned, I was using this sequential way of building a model. This is using a different, more functional form that you can use in TensorFlow. So basically, what we're doing is in the same way, we're kind of defining all of our different layers, but rather than putting them in a list, we put them in a function. And then, so basically, at the start, we have an input layer. Basically, this just says our network starts with, basically somewhere that we're going to put our data in. And then we say, okay, we want to put it through a convolution. In it, we say we want to have 16 filters of size 3 versus 3 by 3. We're going to put it through, we're going to move it over twice every time between these feature extractions. And we're going to do this padding of same, which basically says how we're going to put zeros around the image. Also, something else interesting to note about how this forms is we define this function, then in parentheses, we put what we're inputting into it beforehand. And so you can then notice we do something similar where we say this is x, and then we say, okay, I want to pass x through rel u, which is our activation function. Then I'm going to put it through a pooling of max pool 2D. That means for all the outputs, I'm going to take all local 2 by 2 grids, and I'm going to then compress those down into a single pixel equal to the maximum value. And then I'm going to just do that more with more convolutions. And each time it's going to compress the image more, just the way I'm doing it. And then I'm also increasing the number of filters I want. However, this can be chosen by whoever is to run the code. And then in the end, I would do something called a global pool. What that means is, so in the end, I have an image that is some x times y dimension, and it has 64 feature maps associated with it. A global pool says that for every feature map, I want to compress it down to a single number. So global max pool says for each of these 64 feature maps, I want to then compress it down to the maximum pixel value. And then I'm going to flatten it into a 1D array. So basically, kind of what I was saying, it's like we're transforming our image into more and more abstract representations of the original image. And then that final image just represents how much it contains, maybe some abstract image feature in this new basis that the neural network has chosen for us. And then that just gets passed through a dense neural network again, output size of 10. Here I'm putting it through something called softmax as well. And then we convert it to a TensorFlow object. This softmax function I'm giving it, it basically says I want to transform all of our outputs through what is basically a partition function. This Li is the raw output. Basically says construct a partition function out of the raw outputs, give it some stat-like probability then for the ith output, where it speeds the minus raw output value divided by the partition function. So then before how we construct our network, and then we were defining some various trainable parameters associated with it. So we just call our function and we have it return the network. So it's the network is there for us. And then we're going to also, so rather than calling this fit function, we're just going to do a more manual way of training it. So basically, because we're doing this, we can't just do that .compile function again. So we're doing the same thing. We're using the same optimizer and the same loss function, but we're just assigning them as local variables. And then we're also assigning some metrics. So then basically, this is the big training loop in the code. There's two main sets. This first block here is us running over our training data. So it starts out, and we say we want to go and run our, so we loop over our training data to get our batches, and we basically say that we want to run it through our network and get a prediction, and then run those predictions into true values through this loss function. This is wrapped in this tf.gradient tape function. Basically, it's just a way to associate all of the weights together in a way that it can calculate the loss. So we then have these next three lines. This is then the backwards propagation. So as mentioned, it calculates a gradient. So basically, it does a bunch of derivatives, and then we run it through the optimizer, and then that figures out how to adjust all the weights to minimize this gradient, or minimize the loss function along this gradient. And then we're telling it, oh, we also want to know what the accuracy is, just because that's something that's easier for us to understand. Then afterwards, we basically say, okay, we want to then, if you've gone through an entire epoch, which is what that for loop is, then just print to the output what epoch it was, how long it took, and what the accuracy is. Then we're going to just look at the performance on the testing set, which is the next big block of code. Once again, we're just going to pass it through the network. However, we only do the forward pass. We want to keep track of the accuracy and loss, so we can print that to the screen to see how it's working. And then once it does that for the entire testing set with this for loop, it just prints it to the screen. And then you're just going to repeat that for the desired number of epochs, and that's, yes?
Just 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Yes, I know. I realize it's kind of long, but there's only a few, basic slides left. But basically, so this is all you would need to do to train a convolutional network. You could construct it and train it the same way that I showed for the dense network, or you could do it this way, which has a bit more control on how you do things, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to give an example of both ways to construct, or two different ways to construct and train networks. And these aren't the only two ways as well. But then lastly, I wanted to just kind of talk about the other common types of networks that people would see if they're doing more machine learning. So this is basically for a recursive network. This is the form of our layer. So rather than a single matrix, it's this mess. Basically, the idea is that in ordered data, it can be important to know what came before your current data points. And for example, on your phone, when it's predicting what you're going to text, and it has what word it thinks you're going to say, that depends on the multiple previous words before it. So basically, LSTM is just a way for it to have knowledge of what came before it, and it's kind of weighted in a way where the more recent it is, the more important it is. In a way that makes it so your RAM doesn't get filled up. And so another thing too is these are very good at handling variable length input arrays. So suppose you want to do something with a sentence. So what we say, well, what if we do convolutions along the words rather than using this kind of recursion? But one problem is that sentences are variable length. So if you were to just use convolutions, the outputs, the way it would run through things wouldn't always, match up in a way that works well for maybe later on in the network. Ta-da. All right, and then I was going to go to autoencoders. So basically, this is another very interesting way of using networks. The first half of the network is basically compressing it with smaller and smaller matrices. And then the output decompresses it back to the original size. And then the idea is if the output matches the input, it would mean that if the output size of this is smaller than the original input vector, it's managed to encode and basically compress the original information into a smaller amount of variables. And this has a lot of cool uses. One of them is unsupervised learning. Basically, you don't need to have labels to do this. And so it's going to basically map your inputs into some new latent vector space. And then you can you would notice that similar inputs would be mapped to similar locations. There's word embeddings, which uses this, which is super cool. So there's another shortened link where people can play with that. And this is an autoencoder. Basically, the idea is that if you want to represent words, the easiest way is to make a single vector of length around the dictionary. And then each value is 0 or 1, basically saying whether or not it is that word in the dictionary. It ends up, you can put that through an autoencoder, make it so the innermost layer is a float of length 50, and then it can compress your words into this new vector space where you can do cool things. Like if you have king as a word, you can subtract you can take basically the king in this new vector space, subtract the word for woman or for man, add the word for woman, and then take that new output and run it through the decoder part of an autoencoder, and it will give you the word queen. And you can do cool addition and subtraction to see that it actually correctly knows correlations between words and features of words. Also, defect detection is something you can do. So one example is if you want to detect, say, if somebody uses Photoshop on something, you can run images that have no Photoshop on them through an autoencoder and train it. Then you get images with Photoshop on them, and it will see these slight marks that Photoshop leaves, and then it can basically, those won't be compressed or decompressed properly, and then they will be made more apparent. So basically, this is just saying it looks at the compressed and decompressed bad parts, and then it is just overlaying those over the images again. And then generative networks. So basically, these are ways to generate things. There's pretty crazy things like GPT-3. This is literally, you say the name of a function, and then it tells you how you would code that by training on GitHub. Okay. Okay, I'm sorry. And basically, that is it. And the last part is just machine learning is cool, but it doesn't actually necessarily tell you intuition about what you're looking at. And then it can kind of be used sketchily by so sorry that this was long. There's a lot I wanted to say.